And we are recording. So again, my name is Benicio Rael. I am the Director for Latinx Student Services at the University of Colorado, Denver. Before I introduce our guest, I would like to do a land acknowledgement, and acknowledging that we reside in the homelands of Indigenous people is an important step to recognizing the history and the original stewards of these lands. The United States has worked hard to erase the narratives of Indigenous peoples. However, land acknowledgements help in reminding people about our institution's history, as well as the many contributions Native people have made over time. It is important to understand that land acknowledgements are not a trend. It is important to understand that there are protocols, and a land acknowledgement is not to be just read. The intent of the land acknowledgement must extend far beyond the words you speak in a moment. Land acknowledgements must be implemented throughout the practice and echo through direction and action in supporting and centering Indigenous peoples. So as we gather here today, we honor and acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations. This area was also the site of trade, hunting, gathering, and healing for many other Native nations: the Ute, Lakota, Kiowa, Comanche, Apache, Shoshone, and many other Native nations. We recognize the Indigenous peoples as the original stewards of this land and all the relatives within: the animal nations, plant nations, insect nations, and stone nations. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the ties these nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. Let us acknowledge also the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory. We respect the many diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which we gather. We pay our respect to them and give thanks to all tribal nations and the ancestors of this place. I would like to introduce our guest speaker for today. Dr. Nick Saenz serves as Associate Professor of History at Adams State University. In recent years, he was featured as an interviewee on Settling the Sand Dunes, an episode of Rocky Mountain PBS's Colorado Experience, and contributed to the development of the Borderlands of Southern Colorado exhibits. Currently on display at Colorado History Museum, or History Colorado Museums. Nick holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago and both MA and PhD degrees from the University of California, San Diego. I think you all are in for a real treat again this afternoon. I'm super excited to have Dr. Saenz with us. This virtual event is Latinx History of Colorado, an Unknown History. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Nick Saenz.
Thank you, Benicio. I'm going to go ahead and share some slides here. Hopefully you can see those now. So let me also, thank you, Benicio, for introducing me. I want to give plaudits to CU Denver for having a land acknowledgement statement. Adams State is currently in the process of doing that right now. So you guys, I put a lot of work into that, I'm certain, and it was a thoughtful and well-written statement. I'll be talking a little bit more about the legacy of Indigenous history here in Colorado as it relates to Hispanic history, or I think more appropriately, Latinx history. And so it's a nice way to kind of lead into some of the themes that I want to discuss today. By way of starting out here, just some opening remarks of sorts. Another thing that I think CU Denver is doing really nice is shifting away from this Hispanic language toward Latinx Heritage Month. Of course, that goes back to an old, I think 1968 designation by the federal government to recognize this period between really what is Mexican independence on the 16th of September for about a month to the middle of October is a period to really recognize and celebrate the history of Latinx persons. I would also throw out there that it doesn't just have to be 1 month of 12 out of the year, but this should be something that we reflect upon throughout the whole year. Recently, ethnic studies programs have come under a lot of fire And so I encourage you, if you're a student who's curious to learn more about this, hopefully what follows is an invitation to explore a little bit more of this history. For some, that's going to be a personal journey. For others, it's going to be informative to understanding the world in which they live. But these are truly marvelous programs. I know CU has a ethnic studies program, and certainly MSU has a Chicano program as well. So do consider those as elective options potentially if that's not your major. So what follows is very much a distillation of a talk that I gave originally way back in January, way before the world turned upside down, to a group at the University of Denver associated with the Latino Leadership Institute. And then I distilled that down and I presented it over the summer to the CU Denver fellows, and now down to about an hour to those of you. So, you know, I've tried to take what was a pretty comprehensive survey and kind of reduce it down to, I think, 2 themes that hopefully you can walk away with, getting a sense of sort of a broader understanding than you might have already, and also a lens by which to reflect upon this history more broadly as you continue to encounter it over the coming years. So the first theme that I wanted to talk about is the borderlands identity that I see emerging in Colorado and shaping the history of the state in the course of its development. And then the other one is a conflict or a struggle over inclusion and what that looks like. And over the decades, that has taken various forms, some of them more radical, some of them what we might say as being very systemic or using democratic institutions to pursue that path towards inclusion. Others of them seem, by some mark, to be more radical and maybe extra systemic, but ultimately serving the same goal of participation and inclusion within a system that has historically marginalized the Latinx community. So to start off here, looking at borderlands identity. Actually, let's see here. I might have to hit play from start, so you're not seeing the edited version, the unedited version, but actually the formal version. My apologies. All right, so should be able to see beginnings now, I think. So as Abenicio was mentioning, my journey into this history came largely as a result of collaborating with History Colorado on the reformulation of several exhibits in its Southern Colorado Museum. So those are the El Pueblo History Museum, the Trinidad History Museum, and the Fort Garland Museum and Cultural Center. A number of years ago, there was a vision put forward by the then director of those community museums to incorporate a history that more clearly told the story of Latinx persons in Southern Colorado as really the starting place for the larger history of Colorado. But doing so in such a way that integrated the variety of stories that really brought that Latinx sort of centered or core history out in all of its variegated forms. So that symposium, initially held in April of 2017, resulted in an exhibit that you can actually now see in Pueblo at the El Pueblo History Museum, and I was one of the collaborators on that. Just about 2 weeks ago, we had a conversation about starting an effort to put together a similar exhibit that's going to come to the History Colorado Center in Denver here probably in a number of months. So I encourage you to be on the lookout for that. That'll be an opportunity to maybe deepen your knowledge and better your understanding of some of the ideas that I'll put forward here in a moment. What the focus of this idea of the borderlands of Southern Colorado attempted to put forward was to see Southern Colorado as a place of convergence and collision, where cultures really come together, and in doing so, create something new. This is a site where there was mixing of certainly partnerships and marriages, of business partnerships, of all sorts of spontaneous and in some cases well-structured collaborations between people of very different cultural backgrounds. Ultimately, it was a place too of power inversion, where the sort of traditional power structures that might dominate elsewhere in the world were suspended for a time, leading ultimately to some really interesting episodes in history that cast Colorado as separate and unique, and yet still also part of the larger story of the US West. As a clear piece of inspiration there, the Borderlands Project drew heavily from the work of Gloria Anzaldúa. Many of you, I imagine, are already familiar with her piece, Borderlands, La Frontera, the New Mestiza. If you haven't, I strongly encourage you to take a look at it, especially now during Latinx Heritage Month. This is, I think, a beautiful way to better understand and try to make sense of the rich legacy of this Borderlands history. So Anzaldúa comes out of essentially my world. My family comes from the southern Rio Grande around El Paso. Alamosa is on the Rio Grande, so her world connected very much to the border of the US-Mexico international frontier is nonetheless connected to southern Colorado and the San Luis Valley where I live. She proposes in her book this idea of hybridity, the result of cultures coming together and creating something that is mixed and also new. And that's really a jumping off point for the Borderlands of Southern Colorado project. I'm just going to give you a sampling of her words, and I think these get at the heart of what's going on with this Borderlands history. So I have an excerpt here called "To Live in the Borderlands" that is from the larger work, and it reads, "To live in the Borderlands means you are neither Hispana, India, Negra, Española, ni gabacha, eres mestiza, mulata, half-breed, caught in the crossfire between camps while carrying all 5 races on your back, not knowing which side to turn to run from. To live in the Borderlands means knowing that the India in you, betrayed for 500 years, is no longer speaking to you, that Mexicans call you crejetas, that denying the Anglo inside you is as bad as having denied the Indian or Black. Cuando vives en la frontera, people walk through you. The wind steals your voice. You're a burra, buey, scapegoat, forerunner of a new race. Half and half, both woman and man, neither. A new gender. To live in the Borderlands means you put chile in the borscht, eat whole wheat tortillas, speak Tex-Mex with a Brooklyn accent, be stopped by La Migra at the border checkpoints." So that's just a sampling, but I think she gets at the conflicted nature of Latinx identity in the United States, really as a byproduct of this encounter point between so many cultures, right? What it means to be Latinx is not any sort of unitary monolithic thing, but rather the byproduct of all of these influences working together, sometimes in very clear conflict with one another, but ultimately produce something that is very unique and original. That relates to the Borderlands of Southern Colorado insofar as it offers a different way for thinking about the history of Colorado and the unknown history of Latinx persons in it. So many of you might be familiar with sort of a standard history of Colorado that I would argue tends to give privilege to mines and railroad. Right, so you may remember stories of a Colorado gold rush of 1859, a gold rush that really put the state on the map in some ways, kind of like the California gold rush of 1849. By centering the story of Colorado around that rush, and the resulting organization of Colorado Territory in 1861, the resulting movement of the Transcontinental Railroad westward to incorporate these new gold regions into the evolving economy of the United States. There's a narrative there about the spread of civilization from east to west that I kind of have there graphically portrayed by this very famous painting of Manifest Destiny. This is a history that pits essentially Anglo, white, Easterners against Native peoples who were essentially conquered and removed. Absent to some extent in this history is the history of Latinx persons who predate this encounter and are also part of this story of conquest and conflict. I think it's important to, and again, leading in from or continuing from the land acknowledgement statement, to acknowledge that the history of Latinx persons is intimately tied to the history of indigenous persons. And so as much as we might seek to talk about different groups, what we're actually looking at here is a shared story in part. Latinx persons share the legacy of both being conqueror and conquered. And it's important to recognize that as it fits into the Latinx history within Colorado. So what might a Latinx-centered history look like? I would argue that a solid foundation for thinking about a Latinx history of Colorado should begin with thinking about the relations that existed between and with indigenous peoples, being core to the story of how the state comes about as a community of various peoples. But Latinx persons are both part of that story, and clearly their story in the state begins with a connection to this indigenous history. And I'll talk more clearly about that here in a second. I think what's also really interesting about framing the history of Colorado not as a progression from east to west, but rather from south, so think New Mexico, north towards places like where Denver is currently today, offers us a way to think about, not about so much the exportation of one cultural framework from the East Coast of the United States and its imposition in Colorado, but rather how something truly new emerges in Colorado as a byproduct of all of this cultural mixing and comes to inform locally and then as it spreads outward, the regional development of Colorado eventually as it exists today. This is a history that is not linked to mines and railroad and the so-called spread of civilization. It is a more humble and so maybe less triumphal narrative of conquest and land exploitation. It's a story in some sense of homesteading before the Homestead Act of 1862. So we're looking at the story of farmers and traders more so than titans of industry and the construction of significant industry in the state. So two stories that I think serve to encapsulate this, this alternative framework for thinking about Colorado are first, the story of the early settlement of the Arkansas Valley and specifically the personality of Teresita Sandoval. So the Arkansas Valley was for quite some time the dividing point between the United States and Mexico. So the Arkansas River was an international boundary at one point in time. In the 1840s, there was established on the north side of the river, what was technically still US territory, a trading post called El Pueblo. Although it was not permanently inhabited all the way to the present incarnation of Pueblo, we can still see it. It's kind of the sort of seed, the beginning for modern Pueblo. It was established as a trade post, very similar to Bent's Fort, which is perhaps better known among Coloradans today. But what's really interesting there is that it's not just Anglo traders, but significantly one of these traders brings with him a woman by the name of Teresita Sandoval, who I gave her name a moment ago, a native of Taos, who resided for quite some time, we know, in Mora with a first husband. She apparently had an amorous relationship with another trader by the name of Kincaid and follows him to El Pueblo. And then he eventually leaves and she stays behind and has a family and a life at El Pueblo and can be seen as sort of a starting point for the Latinx history of essentially the area east of the mountains in Colorado. In 1854, El Pueblo was essentially destroyed and the inhabitants fled to various parts of the West. But what we see there with Teresita Sandoval is the story of a woman carving out a beginning in Colorado connected to this cultural system from northern New Mexico, and so linking to that history of this south to north progression. The San Luis Valley is settled at around the same time. There's a number of efforts that take place in the 1830s and 1840s. It's hard to get really solid numbers about who was where first. There's one account from some French trappers, though, that I think gets at a sense of just how significant the presence might have been well before the US-Mexico War. And that's that by about 1840, there were something like 50,000 to 60,000 sheep in the San Luis Valley. And that was reported by a French trader. So where did those sheep come from? They were probably moved into the valley seasonally from northern New Mexicans around what is today Taos. They're probably not living in the valley year-round, though as early as about 1849, there's an indication that there is an attempt to permanently settle the region. That was one undertaken by Tata Atanasio Trujillo. We have his account of how he went doing that. And there's a colleague of mine at CU Boulder who has written on this history as well. A fascinating episode. As best we can tell, Atanasio Trujillo definitely spoke Ute. My presumption is that he probably had Ute ancestry as well. So again, they're connecting to that, that shared experience. Latinx history isn't exclusively European by any means, right? Modern persons of mestizo ancestry are essentially descended from this mixture of different peoples, not just Europeans and Native Americans, but also Africans brought over through the slave trade. But ultimately, Atanasio Trujillo, this very fascinating fascinating character, works with the Utes by his account to settle a site known as Rincones in the southern end of the San Luis Valley. He had probably then been there as a trader a number of seasons before, but in 1849, with Ute support, he settles this area, and it might have continued in perpetuity all the way up to the present, although we don't have firm documentation for that. The town that is often credited as being the first in Colorado is San Luis. It was incorporated in 1851, though almost assuredly there are a number of other sites that predate it. One of the downsides to doing history is that historians often give privilege to written sources. And so San Luis, because it has a documented history of incorporation in 1851, is often given credit, and it is a very old town, but there were likely a number of other settlements in the area that were at least contemporaneous, if not earlier, and surviving all the way to the present. So emerging out of this history, I think the collaborations with different groups, right? Teresita Sandoval and her family are not existing in an environment all unto themselves. They're part of a system of trade that is emerging through cultural contact between US traders coming through the Santa Fe Trail and also this northern New Mexican cultural system in the south that is meeting that trade by moving northward. And then in the San Luis Valley, collaborations between what we might think of as Latinx persons in their own time might have been seen as similarly indigenous to peoples like the Ute, are also moving northward, leveraging those connections and those cultural linkages to settle what is today Colorado. So moving a little bit away from that framework, I want to talk about this idea of struggle and the quest for inclusion. As the borderlands identity makes very clear, by the very nature of being, there's this sort of this notion of internal conflict that is also manifest on the sort of external level through the emergence of political processes that seek to marginalize some of these individuals who move into Colorado and really ought to be credited with its beginnings. You may recall that the dates I gave you a moment ago for El Pueblo and also for the early settlement attempts in the San Luis Valley predate 1848. 1848 is an important turning point because ultimately that marks the end of the US war with Mexico and the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. That is the document that formally transfers what had been roughly one half of Mexico over to the United States and incorporates a good chunk of Colorado. Now, where Denver is today was not part of the Mexican cession. Where I am in the San Luis Valley, it was the Rio Grande River is right where we are, and there had been a claim that the eastern side was Texas, and so that was part of the disputed territory during the U.S.-Mexico War. But Alamosa is firmly on the side that had once been Mexico. And so with this land transfer, there is an upending of some of the legal protections enjoyed by some of the earlier settlers in the San Luis Valley and elsewhere. Part of the problem from the US legal perspective, or perhaps more rightly, those persons who had initially settled the San Luis Valley, is that the US system privileged a system of land occupation based off of surveys. And so I have not actually a land grant document pertaining to Colorado, but this is an image I was able to pull to give a sense of what's going on with the Spanish documents. Spanish documents going back to a longstanding custom in civil law, unlike Anglo-American common law, tended to privilege geographic features in demarcating space geographically. The US survey system did not recognize it, and so many Spanish-based, I can also say civil law-based land documents were simply thrown out in US court cases. And so the early settlers of northern New Mexican extraction are largely dispossessed of their land in a series of court cases through the latter half of the 19th century that sees a significant transfer of what had been Latinx land to recent arrivals from the eastern part of the United States. I have an image here put together for me by Paul Bauman, who teaches out in New York, of the land grants that are found in Colorado. I should note here that there are no Spanish land grants in modern, what is today Colorado. That's a misconception. The land grants in Colorado date from the Mexican period. So between the years 1821 to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. There is one unusual case here in the valley, and that's the Luis Maria Vaca grant number 4. That was actually designated in 1860, well into the US period, following the adjudication of a land dispute in New Mexico. And so the former Baca grant was transferred basically into a series of parcels, one of which was in Colorado. And so that one's an unusual case. So there's actually a US era land grant in what is today Colorado. But I think this map does a nice job of showing, again, this idea of history from south to north with these zones of initial homesteading and settlement, as we might use a language more familiar from US history with homesteading, as this progression works northward towards what is today now the population center of the state. Following this story of land dispossession, or happening kind of alongside of it, there are some early, very violent confrontations that mark the creation of Colorado. So Colorado Territory was organized in 1861 from remnants of New Mexico Territory, Kansas Territory, Nebraska Territory, and Utah Territory. Essentially everything east of the Continental Divide and south of the 38th parallel, so roughly around where Pueblo is today, was part of New Mexico. So where I am in the San Luis Valley had once been administered as part of the regional jurisdiction out of Taos on the other side of the Sangre de Cristo Range. That had been administered out of what is today Mora, New Mexico. The New Mexico Notch was one of the first sections, really, of Colorado to be extensively settled and populated by persons other than indigenous persons. And so a key part of the early beginnings of the state. Shortly into the history of Colorado, one of the more infamous episodes is that of the Espinosa brothers. This is a story that I think still has not been well told. It links up with similar stories like that of Joaquin Murrieta in California, stories of what might sometimes be described best as these kind of Robin Hood characters that we might see as robbing from the rich to give to the poor, or more specifically in an ethnic context, transferring positionality and wealth from persons who once had it to persons who had been dispossessed. The Espinosa brothers have been described, I think, infamously as the first serial killers in the United States. They were actually a family, not just two brothers, but actually a family of individuals who were harassed by the US military out of Fort Garland here in the San Luis Valley. Given the land dispossession that was happening at the time, given some of the wealth transfers that were taking place, these brothers essentially took it upon themselves to set what they saw, to set right a kind of wrong that they would believe was happening in the valley. More recently, the work of Virginia Sanchez, I think, has uncovered this history and offered greater nuance to how we ought to think about the Espinosa brothers, not as bandits or serial killers as they're more oftenly portrayed, but as persons who are trying to offer resistance to their loss of patrimony and land. In that regard, the story of the Espinosa brothers actually syncs up, I think, pretty well with that of Las Guerras Blancas from New Mexico. I have this image here that I think for many is somewhat off-putting, right? The image of people wearing white caps, I think for many elicits these associations with the KKK. And yet, this is a story of firm resistance to this business of Anglo exploitation of what had been Latinx property. The Espinosa brothers, I think, very much fit within this narrative, linking southern Colorado to what's going on a little bit later, but related in New Mexico, as there's this effort to push back against the colonization of the region by Easterners moving into the Colorado Territory. As late as the turn of the 20th century, at around 1900, there were a series of very infamous range wars throughout the San Luis Valley. The early generations of Latinx sheep herders were basically being forced out by more recent arrival Anglo cattle ranchers. And so the conflict over grazing rights and access to the land for ranching purposes was leading to a confrontation between these two groups. So what I want to offer there is, again, this notion of conflict and how it plays out. There is very, very quickly, almost immediately with the arrival of the US presence in the region, this reversal of the fortune of Latinx persons. And that is not something that happens silently. It is a story in which a narrative of resistance, I think, could be better told. And so we could do a better job as historians and scholars linking up this story to other trends we see in the West, and also the story of how Colorado essentially becomes Colorado. Not necessarily the celebratory, triumphal story that many have been told, but I think ultimately a consequential and important one for making sense of the state as it is today. At the same time as there's violent confrontation, there's also some really beautiful stories of Latinx leadership and participation rather in the early development of Colorado's political history. Those of you who have been down to Trinidad to see the Trinidad History Museum have likely walked inside the home of Dolores and Felipe Vaca, essentially two persons wrapped up in the early history of the settlement of the Purgatoire Valley. Vaca, key to the settlement of that town and the larger region, went on to be a territorial legislator in 1870. He's someone who is very interested in making sure that the Latinx voice is present at the territorial level of decision making. With the formation of the Colorado Territory, there was clearly an imbalance in terms of who had weight and power in legislation. Famously, the representatives who were sent to the first meeting of the Territorial Assembly were not even given translators. And so the fact that they spoke Spanish essentially discredited them from being able to fully participate in the early history of Colorado. Vaca and Casimiro Varela are two figures who seek to reverse that story. Varela moved into the region while it was still a territory, went on to serve in the territorial legislature, and actually is seen to be one of the fathers of the Colorado Constitution. And those of you who have looked up at some of the stained glass in the Colorado Capitol have seen likely an image of Casimiro Varela portrayed there on the right. Still to date, the longest serving member of the Colorado Senate. Casimiro had been a champion for a constitution that gave due weight and the ability to participate to Colorado's Spanish-speaking population in the South. And significantly, unlike what had happened in 1861 with the organization of the territory and a political process that largely excluded Latinx persons, when Colorado becomes a state, right? So it becomes a state in 1876. Colorado is a centennial state, so 100 years after 1776. The Colorado Constitution was published not just in English, but also in Spanish and in German, a testament to immigrants who were working in the mines and other areas in the north of the state. But I think that really makes a case for how there are also at this time persons who are working within the democratic system trying to stake a claim for the presence of Latinx persons and their ability to participate fully within the system. Latinx persons also are critical to the early development of institutions in the state, among them trade and commerce. The historical person of Dario Gallegos is part of that story, largely credited with being essentially the first businessman in Colorado. He established Colorado's first general store in San Luis. That is a business that is still alive today. You can go to San Luis and visit the descendants of Gallegos who continue to run the R&R market. And so the history of business and commerce in the state goes all the way back to Latinx roots. There's also the fascinating story of La Sociedad Protección Mutua de Trabajadores Unidos, or sometimes just simplified down to the otherwise still long abbreviation, SPMDTU. I'll say this is often described as a union, although it's not. It's more aptly described as a mutual aid society. This was an effort by Celedonio Mondragon and Antonito to establish an organization to provide essentially safety in numbers for the region's Latinx population against the encroachment and the continued harassment of Anglo ranchers who might seek to undermine the land claims and threaten Latinx persons in the region. This model of using essentially lodges, kind of similar in some respects to the way one might think of Elks lodges today, was so successful, in fact, that the SPMDTU expanded out of Antonito into Utah and New Mexico. It becomes one of the larger social networks and political forces throughout the three-state region. The image I have down there on the bottom right-hand corner is one of the original meeting halls. It was established in Antonito, where the first society is established. That building is currently under renovation, I'm happy to say, and will soon be fully open to the public to come and get a better sense of what this unique institution was and how it contributed to the early history of the state, providing for the Latinx community a voice at a time when it was otherwise being forced into a state of marginalization. So although the history of the state, I think, often is told with a focus on mining and railroads in the north, Latinx persons are critical to the development of the state through farming in the San Luis Valley, for example. The history of mining in the north just wouldn't have been even remotely imaginable. All those miners needed food. Much of it was produced in the San Luis Valley, which emerged early on as a kind of breadbasket for the state as a whole. Many of these early farms were quite small. Later, many persons of Latinx ancestry followed the formation of large corporate farms like those around Greeley, with sugar beet production at the end, the sort of latter half of the 19th century, close to the turn of the 20th century. This initiated a cycle of land loss and property loss, but also explains why there's significant numbers of persons of long-standing deep Latinx roots in places like Weld County in the north of the state. Latinx persons also moved over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains from the San Luis Valley to participate in coal mining in and around Walsenburg and Trinidad, that zone in the southern part of the state, what's today essentially Las Animas and Huérfano counties. And so link up with this history that I think is better known of the infamous Ludlow massacre. What I think is really interesting here is that we have another borderland story. By one account, there were as many as 25 different languages being spoken in these coal mining camps. This was another place of borderlands convergence and coalescence of a unique identity, formed in part by the experience of being workers in this very industrial encounter. But it also serves to demonstrate once again that Latinx persons were present at the early history of Colorado and contributing to the development of the state in economic terms that are, I think, less well known as ought to be the case. Also very poorly understood and actually not generally well known is the Mestis case. And this has gained, I think, public attention in the past 5 years or so. There's a lot of efforts in the Valley to say more about this, but this is an early story of desegregation that links Colorado and the story of fighting for Hispano education to the larger history of desegregation in the United States. In 1912, a man by the name of Francisco Mestis filed a case in what was then Conejos County. That actually the county of Alamosa was organized in 1913, and so this is one of the very first cases in Alamosa County. And he objected to the fact that his son, pictured here, had to walk across town to what was deemed a Mexican preparatory school. So essentially in Alamosa, there was segregation between Anglos, who generally went to a school that was oriented towards college preparation, and a Mexican school that was oriented around more sort of vocational preparedness. Backed by the SPMD2 and also the Catholic Church, Francisco's case went to trial. And as the district court put it, in the opinion of the court, the only way to destroy the feeling of discontent and bitterness, which has recently grown up, is to allow all children so prepared to attend the school nearest to them. This ruling effectively desegregated the schools here in Alamosa County and points to an early history of judicial activism on the part of Latinx persons. Note there, in part, Mestis' case is being brought forward by the SPMD2. Again, this idea of safety in numbers. There's enough sort of critical mass of political organizing by the early years of the 20th century to push back against cycles of marginalization using structures of the state to do so. Of course, despite pushing back, one victory does not ultimately win the war. With the Great Depression, there were, of course, deportations infamously in California. For a time, Colorado tried to restrict the movement of persons from New Mexico northward, seeing New Mexico essentially as the same as Mexico. And so here too, we have a borderland imposed at the US-Mexico Colorado-New Mexico border, largely seeing Latinx persons as a threat to the continued viability of white wealth in the northern part of the state. And you can see there the martial law. Ultimately, this doesn't stand in effect for very long, but there's an effort here to restrict the continued presence of Latinx persons despite this very long history here, right? Generally in times of economic crisis, which I think you even see right now, there is a type of scapegoating or a search for enemies that oftentimes has pitted Anglos against Latinx persons. And here in the state, that was perhaps most acute during the era of the Depression. Flash forward then to the Mexican-American Civil Rights Movement, and I think the scholarship has really done a nice job of trying to separate this movement from the story of the later Chicano movement. There are two groups that kind of emerge out of Texas, Corpus Christi to be specific, LULAC, which has sort of a conservative kind of assimilationist model for inclusion, and the American GI Forum that persuasively uses veteran status as a way to make a claim for participatory rights. These groups gain some ground in Colorado, but coming out of Hector P. Garcia, the organizer of the American GI Forum, are very effective Kennedy clubs, some of which functioned in Colorado, that result in the election of Kennedy, the nation's first Catholic president, right? And so on bounds of religion, Latinos, Latinx persons are able to connect with the Kennedy campaign. These movements we might see as the importation to Colorado of models for inclusion from elsewhere, specifically from Texas. But I think they point to the continuation of this story of political mobilization and organization dating back to the SPMD2, and as we'll see, carrying forward to the era of the Chicano movement. The national level is a story often focused around Cesar Chavez. And I think that is, it's a testament to the person of Cesar Chavez. But here in Colorado, the story of Rodolfo, better known Corky Gonzalez, points once again to the variations that exist and the way in which Colorado Latinx history stands apart from some of the larger themes of this broader national story. Corky Gonzalez was a boxer early on in his life, had a fairly sort of antagonistic, confrontational manner of speaking. I think for that reason, he's less lauded on a level with Cesar Chavez. There's I think a parallel story to what we see with the African-American civil rights movement, right? It's the personality of MLK that is more often celebrated than someone like Malcolm X, who was deemed unpalatable to sort of mainstream Anglo society. Corky Gonzalez was not someone who was willing to back down. It was a continuation of that earlier theme I mentioned, of resistance to cycles of oppression and marginalization. I think you see this coming out in his piece, I Am Joaquin, another piece of literature that I encourage, if you have time to explore during this Latinx Heritage Month. It's not too long, and I think it also plays into some of the borderlands themes I was mentioning earlier. But the movement of Gonzalez, the crusade for justice at an institutional level, contributes to some very famous walkouts, or what are more often known as blowouts, surrounding West High School in 1969. This becomes a sort of generational turning point as a new generation. The children of those parents who are in some cases active as part of the Mexican American civil rights movement really moved to the fore of activism in Colorado in the era of the Chicano movement. And significantly here, Colorado really in many ways is at the heart of the larger Chicano movement. It is the Crusade for Justice that organizes under Gonzalez's leadership the first National Chicano Youth Liberation Student Conference in March of 1969, and that organization ultimately results in El Plan Espiritual de Aztlán, yet another document I'd encourage you to take a look at during Latinx Heritage Month, a document that points to the connection of Latinx persons to an indigenous past, and also calls for a type of national liberation built off of land claims stretching to the Aztec past, and this conception of Aztlán as the birthplace of the Nahua people somewhere in the US Southwest. That document, El Plan Espiritual de Aztlán, connects also to El Plan de Santa Barbara, which was created at UC Santa Barbara in the same year. That document is the one that really calls for the creation of ethnic studies and Chicano studies programs like the ones I was mentioning at the beginning of my talk. As I mentioned, right now, those institutions are under fire and a kind of continuation of the culture wars that arguably go back to the era of the Chicano movement, but are an excellent opportunity for persons to learn more about this history with far more depth and nuance than I'll be able to capture here today. At the same time that there's this very antagonistic and controversial effort to position Latinx persons in Colorado, I would be remiss in not mentioning the story of Vaca. Vaca served in the Colorado House during the 1970s, went on to serve in the Colorado Senate In fact, she is the first woman in any of the 50 US states to serve in both chambers, I should say Latina woman to serve in both chambers of a territorial legislature. So a real trailblazer there. And also the character of Federico Peña, well known, I think, in Colorado, but also actually well known in the nation more generally, a former legislator and then mayor of Denver, who went on to go and to serve in the Clinton administration as both Secretary of Transportation and then later as Energy. They point to a different type of case being made for participation in decision-making at the highest levels of Colorado. In Colorado today, kind of a testament to, I think, both of those legacies, the more radical and confrontational model of Corky Gonzalez and the trailblazing path set by Baca and Peña, are a whole variety of Latinx persons who continue to influence the state and lay claim to the inheritance of Latinx persons who are part of the very fabric of Colorado, dating back to its earliest times. Just a few persons here, Crisanta Duran, recently Speaker of the Colorado House, Daniel Ramos, who was until very recently the leader of One Colorado, the state's LGBT advocacy group, Lucia Guzman, the minority leader in the Colorado Senate, and Joe Garcia, formerly lieutenant governor of the state and currently the president of the Colorado Community College System. Latinx persons who, through their visibility and participation, continue to stake a claim for the legacy of Latinx Colorado. But more close to my neck of the woods, and a way that I think is fitting maybe to finish, is the story of La Sierra and the land grant struggle there. The leadership of Shirley Romero Otero has been instrumental in laying claim essentially to the land grant established at the very beginning of the state's history, attemptedly settled right before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The Sangre de Cristo land grant was among one of the largest land grants ever issued by the Mexican government. But the descendants of the original settlers of this land grant experience, like so many other Latinx persons throughout Colorado, cycles of oppression and dispossession, but successfully launched a court case in 1981, what was, and actually I believe still is, the longest case in Colorado history that effectively ended in 2012 in their favor, laying claim to having access to a section of the Sangre de Cristo land grant, or excuse me, Sangre de Cristo Mountains, based off of the original Mexican land grant. And so many of the residents of San Luis today enjoy access to the land in fulfillment of a Mexican settlement effort that actually predates the existence of the state itself. And why I think this is an interesting place to end, rather than focusing on what we might think of as more high-profile characters in the history of the state, persons like Romero Otero and fellow members of the Land Rights Council have done a lot to live into the legacy of their forebears and ensure that the early history of Colorado and its Latinx roots are not lost. And in many ways, the lifeways established now over 170 years ago continue to be a part of Colorado in the present. So I'll stop there and leave it open to any questions that might exist. I think I'm going to move out of presenter view if I can do that, so I can see the chat function. And so I put my email up there briefly. I can add it to the chat function here if anybody did not have an opportunity to catch it. Let's see here. So just looking at the chat function now, let's see here. So Teresa Ortega writes, the Crusade for Justice led the first posadas in the industrial edge of Denver, aka Commerce City. Certainly a story that is linked to the urban history of Denver. Yanira Duarte writes, Shirley Romero is an amazingly powerful speaker and woman. I encourage you all to look her up and listen to her speak on her and her community's work. And I would echo that sentiment. If you have had an opportunity to speak, just how powerful and just electric of a person she is, but someone who makes a very impassioned claim for the legacy of Latinx persons in Colorado, going all the way back to the very first persons who settled in places like the San Luis Valley. Any questions? Feel free to unmute. I believe that's possible. I don't know if Amnesio restricted unmuting oneself, but then also certainly the chat function if you have any question. So someone asked Shirley's full name. So Shirley Romero Otero. If you scroll up in the chat function, it's actually already in Yanira's post. And I do believe if you search, for example, on YouTube, I think there are some speeches of hers that will come up.
Yeah, so I don't believe that I set it so that you have to request permission to unmute. I think you all are able to do so on your own. So if you have any questions, comments, please feel free to jump in.
I have a question. How do we see ourselves moving forward now, given our history and, we're a force to be reckoned with, but it seems like we're moving backwards.
Yeah, I think I can certainly share a similar sentiment with you there. As a historian, I'm not supposed to prognosticate too much on the future, and yet at a human level, I want to imagine all sorts of very rosy possibilities. I would say, as a historian, I think the story of something like the Mestis case is a maybe fitting explanation, right? So I mentioned that despite the occasional victory, there are steps backwards. And so as bleak as things might look right now, we want to remain vigilant and active in making sure that the future remains as possible, let's say, as it has been at other times in recent history. And so, we're right on the cusp of an election. I can't stress enough how important it is for Latinos to get out and vote. Historically, Latinx persons do not vote at the level that they should. And so we have a real opportunity here to change the narrative. And so we have to pause for a moment and remember, despite all the seeming bleakness, there's always the possibility for some measure of hope. And so hopefully we're on the right path towards renewing the path that we've been on for, I think, the better part of Colorado history. Alyssa Diaz mentions a lot of stuff missed, and I think for many people that's a common story, that a lot of the events that I just talked about, institutions even like the SPMDTU are not well known. They're not necessarily taught in schools, and so I think maybe as a community we can do more to advocate for this type of history being told to younger generations, to give them a sense of presence in the state that is something more than a recent and maybe even kind of ephemeral. But Colorado, to its very name, is rooted in a Latinx past.
As people are thinking of comments or questions, I want to just take a moment to acknowledge someone who was on this virtual workshop with someone who has made history, and that would be, excuse me, someone who was inducted recently into the Colorado Latino Hall of Fame, and that would be Flo Hernandez Ramos. And thank you for joining us this afternoon. I just remember listening to you on the radio station as a kid. My parents always turning on Sunday morning to Canción Mexicana, and there was Flo. So thank you for joining us. It's nice to have you with us.
So I'm noting Noemi posted a question: what organizations can we follow to learn more about Latino history in Colorado? So I will say there's an excellent group out of Boulder, the Latino History Project, that is compiling oral histories and actually publishing some of those histories. And so particularly for the area around Boulder, and to some extent, I think they've also done some oral histories extending into Denver and maybe Jefferson County, that there are some publications out there that give a sense of sort of mid to late 20th century life, especially along the Front Range for Latinx persons. And then again, another plug for History Colorado and its recent efforts to pull together the Borderlands of Southern Colorado project. If you haven't been down to Southern Colorado recently, it's a great reason, perhaps maybe when COVID is over, but I do believe the museums are open. But those exhibits, I think, offer in very visual and graphic form a nice presentation for the Latinx history of Colorado. And like I mentioned, hopefully by about the end of 2021, a version of that exhibit will be coming to Colorado, to Denver, to the History Colorado Center downtown. And then I'm noticing Karen Gonzalez posted the Colorado Society of Hispanic Genealogy. So they too do a number of presentations on Colorado's Latinx history. If you're interested in learning more about you and your family's genealogy, that is an excellent means to do so. I think oftentimes there are persons who would like to explore their family genealogy, but don't quite understand how to go about doing that, are uncertain where to get the resources. Well, with that organization, you have a one-stop shop to begin that process and initiate a journey that for many is totally surprising and always very interesting.
This is Virginia Sanchez.
Hey, Virginia.
Hi, how are you doing? Enjoyed the presentation very much. I just wanted to kind of plug my book, Pleas and Petitions. It's about Hispanic culture and legislative conflict in territorial Colorado. And it was released just last March by the University of Colorado Press. And it discusses the territorial period. So I just wanted to mention that readers might be interested in reading about that part of the history, and hopefully they'll learn new information.
Yeah, I'll put a plug in there as well. Marvelous book, Colorado and the Territorial Period. There's so much going on. The Latinx community really at the heart of that early history. And if you're interested in the Espinosa brothers, although the book isn't solely about them, I know they're an interesting facet of Colorado history for a lot of people, and I think Virginia's probably done more than most to uncover that hidden history that I was alluding to before.
Thank you. Yeah, the interest.
Virginia, I had a little bit of trouble hearing you. I don't know if it was me cutting out or if it was on your.
Oh, well, probably my connection here. No, I was just mentioning that some of the research that I did was at the National Archives, and I found a military census that really opened up the information that we had for the Espinosa brothers. So I think that was a key thing for that part of the research. And the findings of that census also told us a lot more about what was happening in that part of the territory during the territorial period. So it was great. Oh, and I was saying that the name of the book is Pleas and Petitions, P-L-E-A-S, and Petitions.
I'll type that into the chat function here. Virginia, you also gave a few talks with History Colorado a while back, right when your book was coming out, and I think those were recorded and I think are also available online somewhere.
I think they are on YouTube through the History Colorado.
I was gonna say I saw it on YouTube when it came out, and I actually think I have it saved. And if I have it saved, we have everyone who registered. So as I mentioned, this is being recorded, and everyone who registered will get. We'll make sure they get a copy of the link to the YouTube when we post this video. But any other resources we have, I'll make sure they get those as well.
Awesome.
If there are no more questions, I would like to just give a huge thank you to Dr. Saenz for your presentation today, and again, visiting with CU Denver and the Auraria campus. Thank you for the work that you do, and preserving our rich history of who we are and where we come from and our ancestors. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for being with us this afternoon. Thank you to all of you who joined us this afternoon to be a part of the presentation and conversation. Again, this will go out through the Center for Identity and Inclusion YouTube channel. If you registered for this event prior to the start, you'll get the link with additional resources as well. So thank you all so much. Dr. Saenz, thank you so much. Please join me in giving our appreciation to Dr. Saenz and his presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Amanecio.
Thank you everyone for joining. Have a great celebration for Latinx Heritage Month. And again, don't forget to join us on the 15th for Baile Folklorico in Drag, when we celebrate National Coming Out Day and closing of Latinx Heritage Month. Enjoy, and hopefully we'll see you all for Dia de los Muertos.